The son of Rachel found himself in the land of Egypt, bound by the cords of purchase, his freedom exchanged for silver in a transaction he did not consent to. The dust of Canaan still clung to his sandals when the caravan delivered him into the household of Potiphar, captain of Pharaoh's guard. Here, beneath a foreign sky, Joseph began the long season of serving another man's prosperity, while his own inheritance remained distant as the stars his father had shown him in dreams. Before the brothers had sold him, Joseph had walked the hills of his father's land with the confidence of one marked for increase. Jacob's blessing rested upon him like morning dew, and the flocks knew his voice. The promise of abundance had been spoken over his life in visions that came in sleep, showing him grain bowing down and stars offering reverence. His position among the sons of Israel suggested a future where provision would flow through his hands like water from a deep well. The path toward wealth had been laid before him as clearly as the ancient roads that connected city to city. Yet now he woke each morning in the house of an Egyptian master, his labor creating prosperity he could not claim. The promise remained, but the authority to fulfill it belonged to another. Every task completed with excellence added to Potiphar's accounts, while Joseph's inheritance waited in a land he could no longer see. His hands moved with skill, his mind calculated with precision, but the increase flowed away from him like grain poured into another man's storehouse. In those early days in Potiphar's house, Joseph discovered the weight of possessing promise without position. He could see clearly what needed ordering, could envision systems that would multiply resources, could plan harvests that would fill granaries to overflowing. Yet every improvement he implemented strengthened chains he had not forged. His excellence in stewardship served to demonstrate his value as property, rather than his readiness for ownership. The very gifts that should have elevated him instead made him more valuable to his master. The household began to prosper under Joseph's management in ways that surprised even Potiphar. Crops yielded beyond expectation, livestock multiplied, trade agreements flourished. The captain's wealth grew month by month, and other men of Egypt began to take notice of the Hebrew, who seemed to carry blessing in his hands. Yet for all his success in managing another man's affairs, Joseph remained bound by the fundamental reality of his position. He could create wealth but could not claim it. He could multiply resources but could not inherit them. This limitation revealed itself as something deeper than mere circumstance. Joseph began to understand that his captivity was not simply about location or legal status. Even had he remained free in Canaan, the promise within him required a kind of discipline that freedom alone could not forge. In his father's house, surrounded by favor and expectation, he had possessed vision without the tested capacity to bear its weight. Now, in the crucible of service to another, that capacity was being hammered into shape like metal under the blacksmith's careful blows. Days passed into months, and months gathered into years. Joseph's reputation for wisdom and integrity spread throughout the household and beyond. Potiphar entrusted him with greater responsibilities, placing the management of entire estates under his supervision. Yet with each promotion came deeper understanding of the invisible prison that confined him. He could multiply another man's wealth with ease, but his own inheritance remained locked away, waiting for keys he did not possess. The master's wife observed Joseph's excellence and mistook his disciplined strength for something she might capture for herself. Her advances came not from love, but from the desire to possess what seemed so perfectly contained and controlled. Here was a man who could bring order to chaos, who could multiply resources with apparent ease, who carried himself with quiet authority even while bound in service. She saw in him a prize to be claimed rather than a person to be honored. When Joseph refused her advances, he did so not with dramatic declarations or righteous speeches, but with the same steady discipline that marked all his actions. His refusal was as calm and final as winter following harvest. He understood that yielding to her desires would shatter the very foundation upon which his future prosperity was being built. The integrity that made him valuable as a steward would be destroyed, and with it any possibility of the larger purpose toward which his captivity was leading. The woman's fury at his refusal brought swift consequence. Her accusations fell upon willing ears, and Potiphar had little choice but to act upon them. Joseph found himself moved from house arrest to prison, from managing a household to dwelling among criminals and debtors. The transition came without fanfare or protest. He accepted this further confinement as he had accepted his initial captivity, understanding that struggle against unchangeable circumstances was the waste of energy better spent in adaptation. In prison, Joseph discovered that the principles of stewardship remained constant regardless of location. The same discipline that had multiplied Potiphar's wealth could bring order to the chaos of the dungeon. The same wisdom that had managed estates could manage the complex relationships between prisoners and guards. The same integrity that had protected him from compromise could earn trust, even among men who had lost everything. The prison keeper soon recognized what Potiphar had recognized before him. Here was a man who could be trusted with responsibility beyond his station. Within months, Joseph found himself managing the daily operations of the prison itself. He organized the work details, managed the distribution of food, and maintained the records that tracked each prisoner's status and sentence. The keeper slept peacefully, knowing that order would prevail in his absence. Among the prisoners were men who had once served in Pharaoh's court. A butler and a baker, arrested for offenses against the royal household, found themselves sharing the tedious days of confinement with the Hebrew who had become their unofficial overseer. Both men were troubled by dreams that seemed to carry meaning beyond their obvious content. Their distress was evident, though they spoke little of its source. Joseph observed their troubled state with the same quiet attention he brought to all aspects of prison management. When they finally revealed the source of their anxiety, he listened with neither skepticism nor excitement. Dreams, he had learned, could carry significance, but their meaning was not always what the dreamer imagined. The butler's dream spoke of restoration to service, while the baker's foretold a darker end. Joseph shared these interpretations simply, without celebration or sorrow, as one might report the weather or the price of grain. The butler's restoration came exactly as the dream had indicated. Within 3 days he found himself returned to Pharaoh's service, his offense forgiven, his position restored. In his joy at freedom, he forgot entirely the Hebrew who had correctly interpreted his dream. Joseph's request to be remembered before Pharaoh faded from the butler's mind like morning mist. 2 more years would pass in the prison, years that might have brought bitterness to a man less disciplined in the acceptance of circumstance. During those additional years of confinement, Joseph's understanding of his situation deepened beyond the surface level of injustice or delay. he began to see that his captivity was not preventing the fulfillment of his promise, but rather preparing him to bear its weight. Every month spent managing resources he could not own was teaching him principles he would need when abundance finally came under his authority. Every decision made on behalf of others was developing wisdom he would require when making choices that affected entire nations. The dreams that had marked him for future greatness had shown him the end but not the process. Now, in the slow grinding of prison days, he was learning that wealth creation required more than vision or favor. It demanded the ability to maintain order under pressure, to make wise decisions without immediate reward, to steward resources as carefully when they belonged to others as when they might someday be his own. These capacities could not be learned in theory or grasped through revelation. They had to be forged through practice, refined through repetition, tested through trial. When Pharaoh's own dreams finally brought the butler's memory of Joseph back to the surface, the moment came not as rescue but as invitation. The king of Egypt was troubled by visions that none of his wise men could interpret, and suddenly a Hebrew prisoner was remembered who had demonstrated uncanny ability to unlock the meaning hidden within sleeping visions. Joseph was summoned not as a man seeking freedom, but as a resource the kingdom required. Standing before Pharaoh, Joseph carried himself with the same measured dignity that had marked his service to Potiphar and his management of the prison. The interpretation he offered was delivered without drama or self-promotion. 7 years of unprecedented abundance would be followed by 7 years of devastating famine. The meaning was clear, and the necessary response was obvious to anyone trained in the principles of stewardship. Gather during abundance, store with discipline, distribute with wisdom during scarcity. Pharaoh recognized in Joseph not merely the ability to interpret dreams, but the capacity to implement the complex systems that such interpretation demanded. Here was a man who had proven his ability to manage resources, to maintain order under pressure, to make decisions that considered long-term consequences rather than immediate pleasure. The years of captivity had not wasted Joseph's potential, but had refined it into something far more valuable than raw promise. The elevation from prisoner to governor came not as dramatic reversal, but as logical progression. Joseph had demonstrated in small spheres what Pharaoh now needed in a vast one. The same principles that had brought prosperity to Potiphar's household and order to the prison would now be applied to the preservation of an entire civilization. The authority that had been withheld for so many years was granted not as reward for suffering, but as recognition of proven capacity. During the 7 years of abundance, Joseph implemented systems of collection and storage that transformed Egypt into the granary of the known world. His approach was methodical, comprehensive, and utterly without waste. Every bushel of grain was accounted for, every storehouse was strategically located, every detail of preservation was carefully planned. The wealth that flowed through his hands during those years was staggering in its scope, yet he managed it with the same disciplined detachment he had learned while managing Potiphar's estates. When the famine came, as dreams had foretold, Egypt was prepared while surrounding nations faced starvation. Caravans arrived from distant lands, their leaders bearing silver and gold in desperate exchange for grain. Among these were his own brothers, the very men who had sold him into the captivity that had prepared him for this moment. They stood before him without recognition, bowing as the dreams of his youth had shown they would, seeking to purchase from his abundance the means of their survival. The reunion, when it finally came, was marked not by vengeance or triumph, but by the same measured wisdom that had guided every stage of Joseph's journey. He understood that their betrayal had been woven into a larger pattern, one that had shaped not only his destiny, but theirs as well. The years of separation had been necessary, not as punishment, but as preparation. The discipline learned in captivity had created in him the capacity to manage not only wealth, but the complex emotions that wealth can provoke. His father Jacob, now aged and weathered by years of believing his beloved son was dead, wept when the news reached him that Joseph lived and ruled in Egypt. The reunion of father and son took place not in the land of promise, but in the land of Egypt, where Joseph's authority could provide for the entire family during the remaining years of famine. The promise of increase had been fulfilled, but in ways that none of them could have imagined when it was first spoken. In those final years of his father's life, Joseph understood fully what his journey had accomplished. The wealth he now controlled was not merely the accumulation of resources, but the creation of capacity. Every year of captivity had built within him abilities that freedom alone could never have developed. Every month of managing another man's prosperity had prepared him to manage abundance on a scale that dwarfed anything his youthful dreams had envisioned. The discipline that had sustained him through bondage became the foundation of his stewardship in freedom. The patience that had carried him through false accusation and forgotten promises enabled him to navigate the complex demands of governing during crisis. The integrity that had protected him from compromise in private quarters now guided his decisions in public office. The wisdom gained through years of careful observation now informed choices that affected the survival of nations. When Jacob died and was buried with honor, Joseph continued to provide for his brothers and their families, not from obligation or duty, but from the overflow of abundance that disciplined stewardship had created. The wealth that flowed through his administration blessed not only Egypt, but every nation that came seeking relief from famine. The resources he managed became the means by which civilization survived and cultures were preserved. In his later years, Joseph reflected often on the path that had brought him from his father's fields to Pharaoh's court. The journey had been longer than he had imagined it would be, more complex than his youthful understanding had grasped, more painful than his optimistic spirit had anticipated. Yet every stage had been necessary, every delay had served a purpose. Every limitation had created capacity that freedom alone could not have forged. The brothers who had sold him into captivity lived to see their children and grandchildren prosper under his provision. The promise that had seemed destroyed by their betrayal had instead been refined through the very circumstances they had created. The wealth that might have come to him easily in his father's land had been transformed through trial into something far more substantial and enduring. Joseph came to understand that true prosperity was not the accumulation of resources for personal enjoyment, but the development of capacity to steward abundance for the benefit of many. The discipline learned in captivity had taught him to value stability over luxury, sustainability over immediate gratification, and the welfare of others over personal advancement. These lessons could not have been learned in comfort or grasped through instruction alone. The systems he had created to manage Egypt's resources during the famine became the foundation for sustained prosperity long after the crisis had passed. His methods of collection, storage, and distribution were studied and implemented throughout the ancient world. The principles he had discovered through years of managing other men's wealth became the standards by which future generations would measure wise stewardship. As his own life moved toward its close, Joseph saw clearly that his captivity had not delayed his destiny, but had prepared him to fulfill it in ways that would have been impossible had he remained free. The years of bondage had compressed within him capacities that decades of ease could never have created. The wealth he controlled at the end of his life was greater not only in quantity, but in quality than anything he might have achieved through easier paths. His final years were marked by the same quiet dignity that had characterized his service in every circumstance. He continued to oversee Egypt's prosperity with careful attention to detail, ensuring that the systems he had established would continue to function long after his guidance was no longer available. The legacy he prepared to leave was not merely personal wealth, but institutional wisdom that would benefit generations yet unborn. The Hebrew who had entered Egypt as purchased property departed as honored statesman, but the transformation had occurred not through sudden elevation, but through gradual refinement. Each stage of his journey had built upon the previous one, creating through discipline and trial the capacity to bear prosperity without being corrupted by it. The wealth that had been promised in dreams had been fulfilled in reality, but in forms more substantial and enduring than the dreamer had initially understood. When death finally came to Joseph, it found him at peace with the path his life had taken. The captivity that had once seemed to threaten everything he valued had instead shaped him into someone capable of creating and managing wealth on a scale that blessed entire civilizations. The promise that had been delayed had not been diminished, but had been multiplied beyond anything his youthful imagination had conceived. These are the chronicles of wealth, not as men desire it, but as it is formed.